Chapter 1. The Whisper in the Walls. The storm had arrived just as the guests were finishing their appetizers. It clawed over the Cornish cliffs like some great grey beast, wind howling against the lead-paned windows of Bogart House. Outside, the sea roared as if echoing the turmoil within. Inside, amidst the splendour of an ancestral sitting room lined with hunting portraits and faded books, Lady Estelle Bogart's annual spring gathering was already unravelling into unease. She had invited them all, old friends, tenuous relatives, an unexpected cousin from Belgium, and even a renowned playwright, for a weekend of cards and port, supposedly. But no one could quite pretend the air wasn't tense. The lady of the house had grown increasingly forgetful, and her solicitor, Mr. Chatterley, had alluded to unusual recent changes in her will. That evening, the staff seemed flustered. The long-standing cook had taken ill, and the parlourmaid refused to enter the east wing at all. At precisely 8:30, during a lull between lightning flashes, a scream pierced the halls. It came from the breakfast room, once used for family gatherings, now little more than a holding pen for guests who could not sleep. People rushed in, Colonel Frobisher with his pocket revolver, Mrs. Ada Grenville in her shawl, young Miss Lucia Vale with one slipper off. And there, slumped on the floor near the dumb waiter, lay the body of Miss Margot Lane, the housekeeper. Her stiff hand pointed toward a porcelain bowl shattered beside her. Her eyes, wide with fear, seemed to plead for an answer none could give. A thin trickle of blood stained the pale carpet beneath her temple. In the corner, a shattered teacup lay tipped over, its contents soaking into a lace doily. "She's dead," Colonel Frobisher muttered, 2 fingers at her throat. "Blow to the head, poor girl." Lady Estelle swayed and sat abruptly. "But she was just here. She brought me my embroidery this morning, and oh heavens, I told her to fetch my tonic from the pantry." Chatterley moved to call the constable. But in that peculiar silence that follows death, a strange, unspoken consensus settled in the room. The housekeeper's demise was no accident. No one said the word murder, but no one doubted it either. What made the air colder even more than the gale outside was the look exchanged between Mrs. Grenville and Estelle, a silent flicker of recognition, of dread. "She's the second this month," Lucia whispered, barely audible. "First the gardener, now Margot." "Heart failure," said Chatterley too quickly. "They said it was heart failure." Frobisher snorted. The gardener was 35 and could lift a hogshead, dead in the potting shed with a face like thunder. Before anyone could respond, the power flickered, and the house plunged into shadow. Gasps, shuffling, someone dropped a glass. Only the firelight from the hallway offered any light as the guests clutched each other. It was a full 5 minutes before the butler, Mr. Phipps, managed to relight the sconces. When he did, Lady Estelle had retreated to the armchair nearest the hearth, her hands trembling. "We need help," she whispered. "Proper help. It's not the house. It's someone here, among us." She looked pointedly at the guests, one by one. Then came the voice from the doorway, accented, refined, unmistakably foreign. "Madame is correct. What has happened here is unnatural, but not supernatural. A crime, I fear, has made its entrance, no?" All heads turned. He stood there, still buttoning his elegant grey overcoat, his hat tucked beneath one arm, his moustache immaculate, despite the storm outside. "I am Hercule Poirot," he said with a slight bow. "And though I was only meant to rest a few nights before travelling to Truro, I believe it is fate that I find myself in your charming abode on this tempestuous evening." A silence followed, taut with disbelief and tentative hope. Poirot stepped forward, gaze sweeping the room with the elegance of a man who had already taken stock of everything. The blood on the carpet, the fragments of porcelain, the unspoken tension in every glance. "I am, as they say, off duty," he continued. "But alas, one does not turn away when death makes such an inconsiderate appearance." Lucia Vale took an impulsive step forward. "You mean you'll investigate? You'll find out who did it?" Poirot's expression was serene, even amused. "Mademoiselle, one must first be sure that a who is involved at all. But I suspect," and his eyes flicked toward the corner where the teacup lay, "that we shall not be long in confirming that suspicion." He turned to Chatterley. "Until the local police arrive, may I request that no one leave the premises?" Chatterley bristled. "I don't believe we need to—" "Non, monsieur," Poirot interrupted gently. "We are all civilized, yes, but civility does not prevent guilt, and murder, like love, often hides behind excellent manners." He moved to the body with care, his eyes narrowing as he bent to inspect the cup. He lifted a shard delicately between two fingers. Ah, a curious scent. Then he looked at the guests. "I will need to speak with each of you, one by one. We shall begin at once, if you please." Outside, the wind howled as if to agree. Inside, Bogart House settled into a terrible, waiting silence. The housekeeper was dead, and Hercule Poirot had just begun. Chapter 2. The cracks in the china. Hercule Poirot's presence, though slight in frame and modest in tone, had a peculiar effect on the atmosphere within Bogart House. In the aftermath of Margot Lane's death, the guests had begun to drift into quiet corners, whispering, doubting, rearranging the fragile social alliances that had bound them together for the weekend. But now they watched Poirot, half in curiosity, half in dread, as he moved, with purpose, through the breakfast room. Poirot crouched beside the body once more, lifting the lace doily with the delicate concern of a man plucking a flower. He turned to Mr. Phipps, the butler, who hovered in the doorway like a figure carved from old mahogany. "Monsieur Phipps," Poirot said, "who prepared the tea that Miss Lane was drinking?" Phipps hesitated. "The housekeeper brewed her own. She insisted on it, monsieur. She took the tray from the kitchen herself, perhaps a quarter of an hour before the scream was heard." "Did anyone see her?" The butler nodded slowly. "The scullery maid, Ivy, she'll confirm it." Poirot glanced back at the shards. "And that tea, what blend is preferred in this household?" Lady Estelle, who had returned despite her evident distress, answered with a brittle smile. "Margot drank chamomile before bed. Always. She said it settled her nerves." Poirot's moustache twitched. "How curious! Chamomile has a very specific aroma, yet the scent I detect on this fragment," he held it aloft, "is something sharper, almost metallic." He turned, addressing the room now. "Has anyone here any knowledge of poisons, of pharmacology?" No one spoke. But Ada Grenville's eyes dropped to her lap. Poirot filed the silence away. He rose, brushing off his knees with a flick of his handkerchief. "Forgive me. It is not my intention to accuse, merely to observe, and already I observe that there are more puzzles than answers. Allow me, then, to pose the first question that must be answered before all others." He turned slowly, letting his gaze pass over each face in turn. "Why would someone wish to kill Miss Margot Lane?" A cough, a shuffle of feet. Colonel Frobisher cleared his throat with the stiffness of a man used to command. "Well, she wasn't the friendliest soul, I'll give you that. Walked about as if she owned the place, despite only being in service, but kill her, damned extreme." "She had keys," Chatterley offered. "To everything, cupboards, safes, even the attic, where Lady Estelle's late husband kept his naval records. She was trusted, perhaps too trusted." Poirot nodded thoughtfully. Trust, monsieur, is often a weight heavier than gold, and far more dangerous. Miss Lucia Vale had taken a seat in the corner, one leg tucked beneath her. She was watching Poirot with keen, almost hungry eyes. She had secrets, she said softly. All the staff were scared of her, even Phipps. She used to listen at doors, report things. Lady Estelle said it was necessary. Discipline, she called it. But it felt like surveillance. Estelle straightened at the accusation, her lips tight. Margot kept order in this house when I could not. She protected my reputation, my late husband's legacy. She knew her place. Poirot turned toward her. And yet, madame, the dead often reveal things the living would rather keep hidden. A flash of anger passed over Estelle's face before she caught herself. She adjusted the brooch at her collar. Poirot, ever polite, took a step back. Forgive me, I ask questions that may seem unkind, but a murder has occurred, and in such moments, etiquette must yield to necessity. He turned to the remaining guests. Until the police arrive, I must request that each of you remain within the main house. No guests are to enter the kitchen or the servants' quarters. Mr. Phipps, please see to it. Phipps bowed slightly. Yes, monsieur. Poirot turned back to the scene of the crime one last time, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the floor. There, near the dumbwaiter, lay something curious, nearly hidden beneath the sideboard, a small, pale square of folded paper. Poirot bent and retrieved it. It was damp at the edges, and the ink had begun to run, but he could still make out a line scrawled hastily. He knows. Stop before it's too late. Poirot folded it gently and placed it into his pocket without comment. He moved to the doorway, pausing to address the guests once more. You will all forgive me if I ask to speak with each of you in turn tonight. And until then, please, do not speculate aloud. The killer may still be listening. With that, he disappeared into the hallway, with that brisk, silent step that masked the gears grinding furiously behind his polished demeanor. Behind him, the guests began to stir, murmuring again in half-formed whispers. And in the air, above the storm and the candlelight, there lingered not just fear, but the beginning of suspicion. Chapter 3. The Portraits That Listen. The drawing-room of Bogart House was built for silence. Its thick velvet curtains muffled even the wild cries of the sea beyond, and the rows of solemn ancestral portraits, long-faced Bogarts in powdered wigs, starched collars, and naval uniforms, stared down at the living with a kind of mute condemnation. Into this chamber Poirot now stepped, bidding Mr. Phipps bring tea, not for comfort, but observation. Lady Estelle sat beneath the largest portrait, Admiral Percival Bogart, known for his command in the Channel Wars and his legendary duels over honour. The old lady appeared smaller than she had earlier, as though the weight of death in her house compressed her stature. She gripped her cane tightly, tapping it once against the tiled hearth. "Must this be done now, Monsieur Poirot?" she asked, her voice carefully even. "We're all quite shaken." Poirot offered her a polite nod. "Madame, precisely because you are shaken, the mind reveals things it would otherwise hide. If I wait, your answers may become rehearsed. You understand?" Estelle gave a brittle smile. "You're quite adept at pressing forward." "It is the duty of one who wishes to see justice served." She gestured toward a cushioned chair opposite. "Very well. Ask what you will." Poirot sat gracefully, his legs precisely crossed. "Madame, how long has Miss Lane served this household?" 22 years, Estelle answered without hesitation. "She came to me as a young woman after her father's death. Competent, discreet, loyal." Poirot tilted his head. And yet you entrusted her with matters that exceeded her role, keys to secure rooms, knowledge of sensitive documents. Lady Estelle's gaze shifted slightly. Because she earned my trust. When my husband died and the estate's finances faltered, it was Margot who kept things in order. She knew how to manage the staff, how to prevent gossip. Did she know about the will? Poirot asked. The tapping of the cane stopped. She may have. I had spoken to Chatterley about revisions. Margot overheard many things. But you never told her directly? No. Poirot leaned forward just slightly. And these revisions, do they concern your niece? A flicker passed across Estelle's face. Lucia, what about her? Did Margot approve of Miss Vale? Margot never voiced an opinion, at least not openly. Sometimes silence is louder than speech, Poirot murmured. Tell me, Lady Estelle, had Miss Lane ever threatened you? The old woman stiffened. Certainly not. Poirot studied her, watching how the knuckles around her cane whitened. Yet you are afraid. Not just now, but before. You sense something beneath the surface. Estelle glanced up at the portrait of Admiral Bogart. This house has old bones, Monsieur Poirot. Old secrets. I fear I no longer know what lies in its walls. Poirot gave a gentle nod. Merci, madame. You have been most helpful. As Estelle stood with difficulty and Mr. Phipps arrived to assist her away, Poirot remained seated, lost in thought. His eyes wandered across the gallery of stern faces staring down at him from their gilded frames. Old secrets, he repeated softly. A sound broke his reverie. Light footsteps. Lucia Vale stepped into the room, her expression curious. May I? She asked. Poirot gestured to the seat Lady Estelle had just vacated. She dropped into it with unceremonious ease. Quite a scene, isn't it? Like something out of a Wilkie Collins novel. Or a Greek tragedy, Poirot said, smiling faintly. You have an eye for drama, Mademoiselle Vale. I'm a failed actress, Monsieur Poirot. It comes with the territory. You do not seem particularly disturbed by Miss Lane's death. Lucia's brow arched. I am disturbed, just not surprised. There's been tension in this house for weeks. Between whom? Margot and my aunt, Margot and Chatterley, Margot and me. She gave a wry smile. Margot wasn't particularly warm. Did she dislike you? I don't think she liked anyone. But she disliked me most when I arrived. She said I was here to take what didn't belong to me. That I reminded her of someone. I never knew who. Poirot's eyes narrowed. Interesting. Lucia leaned forward, dropping her voice. I think Margot was blackmailing someone. She used to get letters delivered separately from the house post. I saw her stash them behind a broken panel in the library mantel. Poirot's ears perked up. And did you look? Lucia gave a guilty little shrug. Of course. Were they signed? Number typed, no return address. But she kept them like trophies. Poirot rose at once. Would you mind showing me this panel? Lucia led him through the dim hallway, past ancestral muskets and sepia-toned war medals, until they reached the library. The hearth was cold, the curtains drawn. She pointed to the right column of the carved mantel. There, she said, it sticks, but it opens. Poirot reached into his coat and drew a delicate pocket knife. With a small press, the panel gave way. Inside was a thin envelope containing 2 letters. He extracted them, reading the first line aloud. You are not safe if the truth emerges. Cease your meddling. He looked at Lucia. And now, Mademoiselle Vale, the mystery deepens. Outside, the storm began to recede, but within Bogart House the clouds were only beginning to gather. Chapter 4. The Footsteps in the Pantry. The library's cold hearth and hidden panel had yielded Poirot more than paper. They had given him a scent. Not just the literal perfume of aged ash and candle wax, but the intangible aroma of fear, of secrets preserved far too long in silence. The letters Lucia had found were brief, but ominous, unsigned, and typed on an old machine, the ink slightly smudged. Poirot folded them carefully into his notebook and made a mental note. Typed, impersonal and oddly formal, a voice pretending detachment to conceal personal urgency. He returned to the drawing room only long enough to request Phipps bring the scullery maid, Ivy, to him in the kitchen. The kitchen, in contrast to the rest of Bogart House, was unpretentious. A long wooden table ran through the centre, the stove crackled with leftover warmth, and copper pans hung overhead, dulled by years of use. The pantry door stood slightly ajar. Poirot noted the details automatically. Crumbs near the bread box, a broken bottle of vinegar in the corner, cleaned, but still smelling faintly sour, a missing hook on the rack where one pan should have hung. Ivy appeared in the doorway, pale-faced and clutching the hem of her apron. "You wish to speak with me, sir?" she asked, curtsying slightly. "Ah, Mademoiselle Ivy, please, sit. Do not be frightened." She perched on the edge of a kitchen stool. "You saw Miss Lane earlier this evening, oui?" "Yes, sir. Around 8 o'clock. She came in and told me to go polish the brass candlesticks in the dining room. She said she'd handle her own tea." "And what did she do then?" Ivy fidgeted. "She took her usual mug down from the shelf. White china with a blue rim. The one with the chip." Poirot's eyes flicked to the mug rack. "And where is that mug now?" "It broke, sir. That was the one found on the floor beside her." "Did anyone else enter the kitchen while she was here?" "No, sir, but—" "But—" "Well," Ivy hesitated, twisting her fingers. "After she left, I heard something. I was halfway to the dining room, but I came back to grab a polishing cloth, and I heard footsteps, very soft ones, in the pantry." "Inside the pantry?" Poirot asked gently. Ivy nodded. "I thought it was one of the footmen at first, but when I called out, no one answered. The door creaked shut a second later. I got scared and ran off." Poirot rose and crossed to the pantry, slowly pulling the door fully open. Inside were shelves of neatly stacked goods, biscuit tins, dried herbs, preserves. But near the back, behind a crate of oranges, a second door was half concealed by shadow. "This?" Poirot asked. "Yes, sir. It leads to the old dumbwaiter shaft. No one uses it anymore." Poirot opened the small door. The shaft descended into darkness, though rusted cables suggested it had once been quite functional. There were faint smudges along the wall. Recent, a hand bracing itself, a shoe scraping downward. "Merci, Mademoiselle Ivy," Poirot said, closing the panel gently. "You have been most helpful. One last question. Did Miss Lane seem agitated when you saw her?" "She looked tense, and she was humming." Poirot's brow furrowed. "Humming?" "Yes, sir. A strange tune. Slow, minor key, not like her usual self." Poirot nodded and dismissed the girl with a kind smile. As she departed, he stood in the centre of the kitchen and turned slowly, absorbing the room like a painter studying a still life. Then he turned toward the dumbwaiter shaft again. His gaze lingered. Hidden doors, secret letters, silent footsteps, and now, music. Poirot had known killers who disguised their rage in laughter. He had known others who wept over their crimes, as if mourning someone else's sins. But the ones who hummed? They were the most dangerous of all. A soft cough interrupted his thoughts. Chatterley, the solicitor, stood in the doorway, adjusting his tie with one gloved hand. "I was told you were in here, Monsieur Poirot. Might I have a word?" "But of course, monsieur. Please come in."
Chatterley hesitated, visibly uncomfortable amidst the scullery pots and the scent of onions. I thought it best to inform you now, rather than let idle gossip distort the truth. A wise instinct, Poirot replied, motioning him to continue. Chatterley cleared his throat. I did in fact meet with Miss Lane 3 days ago. She summoned me to the library under the pretence of discussing estate inventories, but she wished to know if I had knowledge of changes Lady Estelle was making to her will. Poirot's eyebrows lifted. And did you? I told her only that revisions were underway, nothing more. Did she seem angry? Chatterley hesitated. More urgent, as though she were racing against something. Or someone, perhaps. He adjusted his cuffs. I did not see her again after that evening. Poirot offered a quiet nod. Thank you for your candour, monsieur. As Chatterley departed, Poirot remained in the kitchen, alone with the scent of herbs and something fainter, metallic again. He crouched beside the pantry threshold, eyes narrowing. There, barely visible beneath the skirting board, was a thin smear of something dark. Poirot touched it with his gloved finger, then sniffed. Not blood, not grease, ink, fresh ink, smeared, as if someone had tried to hide a typed note in haste. Poirot straightened slowly, the shadows deepening behind his eyes. The housekeeper had brewed her own tea, but someone else had added the final ingredient. And Poirot now would find them, one footstep, one contradiction at a time. Chapter 5. The Mask of the Colonel. By the time the grandfather clock in the front hall struck 9:30, the wind had begun to settle, and the rain fell with a steady, contemplative rhythm, less fury, more thought. Poirot sat now in the small smoking room with Colonel Archibald Frobisher, a glass of port untouched at his elbow. The walls were panelled in oak, lined with cigar boxes, and a large sabre hung ceremoniously over the fireplace. It suited the Colonel's persona rather too neatly, Poirot thought. The Colonel was stiff-backed, legs crossed precisely, his moustache rivaling Poirot's in both structure and pride. But where Poirot's bore elegance, Frobisher's was combative, each bristle a declaration of war. "You served in India, oui?" Poirot asked casually. "Indeed, 27 years with the Royal Lancers. Retired when they began replacing good horses with noisy engines." "You did not approve of the modernization?" Frobisher's eyes narrowed. "I did not approve of incompetence being called progress. The world now favours machines over men. It does not suit me." Poirot inclined his head politely. "And what brought you to Bogart House this weekend?" "Old Estelle and I go back a long way. She was my late wife's cousin. I've known this estate since it had 4 gardeners and 2 pheasant keepers. I make it a point to visit once or twice a year." "Did you know Miss Lane well?" Frobisher grunted. "Well enough to avoid her when possible. She was always meddling, asking questions. Came sniffing around my luggage once, if you can believe it." Poirot's eyebrows arched delicately. "Did she? What was she looking for?" "How the devil should I know?" the Colonel snapped, then caught himself and added more smoothly, "But if I had to guess, she thought I was hiding whiskey. I have a doctor's letter, you see. Heart complaints, no salt, no spirits. Margot liked to enforce things." Poirot folded his hands. "And did you obey her?" The Colonel's expression hardened. "I'm a guest, not a recruit." "Did you—" Argue with her? She said something snide last evening, claimed I was keeping secrets in the West Wing. Nonsense. Are you? Frobisher's jaw tightened. My secrets died with my commission, Poirot. I'm an old man with nothing to hide. Poirot rose and walked slowly to the small table near the hearth. A pile of neatly stacked chess pieces stood there, mid-game. and yet you keep yourself occupied with strategy." Frobisher smiled without warmth. "War never leaves you, monsieur. The battlefield simply changes." Poirot turned toward the fireplace. "Colonel, forgive my curiosity, but when you were stationed in India, did you become familiar with herbal toxins?" The colonel looked amused. "Planning to poison me now?" "On the contrary, I am wondering who in this house might have already done so." Frobisher sat forward, his tone suddenly taut. "If you're implying I had anything to do with Margot's death—" "I imply nothing, monsieur. I ask only because a curious residue was found in the teacup. Not a known British poison, something rarer." The colonel exhaled through his nose. "There are compounds used in Assam, bitter herbs, subtle, slow-acting. You'd need a precise hand." "And do you possess such a hand, mon colonel?" Frobisher stared at him down for a long moment, then leaned back in his chair. But I know someone who might." Poirot tilted his head. "Please." Frobisher reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small black notebook, worn at the edges. He opened a page and handed it over. Poirot glanced at it, a scribbled list of observations in tiny military print. "Margot was receiving something in brown glass bottles," the colonel said, "from outside the village, not the local chemist." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "You kept notes?" "Old habits." The colonel tapped his temple. "When someone behaves oddly in a house full of guests, I notice. It's what kept my men alive." Poirot smiled faintly. "And perhaps yourself too?" He returned the notebook. "Did you see from whom she received the bottles?" "Numbum, but I once saw Phipps carry one into her room." Poirot's gaze turned inward for a moment, piecing together the fragments. "Merci, Colonel. You have the eye of a soldier and the instincts of a detective." Frobisher looked grim. "I have the instincts of a man who's been lied to too many times. That's all." Poirot bowed slightly and turned to leave. But as his hand touched the doorknob, Frobisher spoke again. "There's something else." Poirot turned. "2 nights ago, I caught Margot in the upstairs hallway outside Estelle's study. It was well past midnight. She claimed she was inspecting a draft, but I heard paper being torn." Poirot's expression did not change, but a flicker of interest danced behind his eyes. "Merci, mon ami. That is most illuminating." The door shut softly behind him. Alone again, the colonel
poured himself the port he'd earlier refused. His hand shook slightly. Across the room, the chessboard remained unfinished, black bishop poised, white queen vulnerable, a game in mid-play, just like the house, just like the truth. And somewhere between silence and suspicion, the killer waited, watching them all. Chapter 6. Shadows in the Attic. The staircase to the upper floor of Bogart House creaked beneath Poirot's careful steps. Though his tread was light, the aged wood responded like an old confidant disturbed from slumber. Outside, the storm had dulled to a distant whisper, but within the house, a quiet tension still clung to the rafters, thick and undisturbed, especially in the narrow corridor that led to the attic. Lady Estelle's house was full of forgotten corners, but none more so than the attic staircase. The door at the top, painted a faded hunter green, bore no lock, just a tarnished brass knob and the peculiar scent of mothballs and memory. Poirot turned the handle. The attic opened before him like a still life. Crates stacked 2 and 3 high, furniture draped in white sheets, oil lamps, and old nautical gear from Lord Gerald Bogart's Navy days. The air was musty, but still carried something else, ink, perhaps, or the ghost of a perfume that had not been worn in decades. Poirot moved with care, his gloved hand brushing dust from an old phonograph cabinet. Lady Estelle had once told a newspaper that the attic held nothing of consequence. That, Poirot had learned, often meant quite the opposite. Near the far corner stood an unlocked sea chest, its lid slightly ajar. Inside were brittle papers, bound ledgers, and a rolled-up naval chart marked with tiny crimson crosses. Poirot raised an eyebrow. Odd, but not yet criminal. What caught his attention was the old writing desk beside it, and more specifically, the wastebasket beside that desk. Inside he found a half-burnt scrap of a letter. You know what happened in 17. If anyone finds out, we both... The rest was scorched. Poirot's fingers tightened. Secrecy, scandal, an old incident buried in time, and now threatening to rise. Footsteps suddenly echoed behind him. Poirot turned, unsurprised, to see Mr. Chatterley ascending, lantern in hand. The solicitor's brow was beaded with sweat despite the cold air. "Ah, Monsieur Poirot," Chatterley said with a tight smile. "I saw the door was open. I thought perhaps one of the guests had wandered where they shouldn't." "Indeed, monsieur," Poirot replied evenly. "It seems many things in this house prefer to remain in the shadows." Chatterley offered a polite chuckle. "Yes, well, the attic is hardly a place for refined company, though Lady Estelle often asked me to store sensitive files up here, her late husband's financial papers mostly. A frightful mess." Poirot gestured to the burnt paper. "And this frightful mess?" Chatterley's eyes flicked toward the wastebasket. "No idea. Likely some discarded draft. The lady has been reviewing old documents in preparation for the new will." Poirot did not reply. He instead walked to a locked cabinet in the corner. Unlike the other furniture, it was new, too new for the room, with polished brass hinges and a tiny modern keyhole. "Do you know what this contains?" Chatterley's tone was casual. "Medical records, Estelle's private files. Margot Lane insisted on keeping them secure." "Interesting," Poirot murmured. Mademoiselle Lane was quite thorough. Chatterley hesitated. "She would protective of Lady Estelle, of the estate's integrity." "Protective," Poirot repeated softly. "Or possessive?" Chatterley didn't answer. Poirot stepped past him, brushing a hand along the dusty spine of a ledger. "You know, monsieur," he said lightly, "when people lie, they often do so with confidence. But when they fear being caught in the truth, they hesitate." Chatterley bristled. "I've no idea what you mean." "No? Then perhaps you might explain why at 8:30 tonight you were not in the drawing-room with the others, but were instead near the pantry door." The solicitor stiffened. How could you possibly—" "I do not guess," Poirot said, gently. "I observe. And your boots, monsieur, carry faint traces of vinegar, like the kind spilled in the kitchen earlier." Chatterley's mouth opened, then closed. "I may have passed by. I went to fetch water for Lady Estelle." "Of course," Poirot said, his tone pleasant. "And did Margot Lane see you?" A pause. "No," Chatterley muttered. "She was already gone." Poirot stepped closer, his voice lowering. "You and Miss Lane had an argument 3 days ago. You feared she knew something about the will, perhaps a clause she intended to challenge. She had access to everything. She kept notes, she listened. And someone, perhaps not you, wanted those notes silenced forever." Chatterley turned away. "You're twisting shadows, monsieur. All I've done is serve the estate." "But who does the estate serve?" Poirot asked. Chatterley did not answer. Poirot let the silence stretch, then quietly excused himself and descended the attic stairs, leaving the solicitor amid the dust and the watching silence of Lord Gerald's forgotten treasures. He had not accused Chatterley, not yet. But like every good liar, Chatterley had misjudged the importance of what he omitted, and that, Poirot knew, was far more telling than anything he said aloud. Downstairs the guests waited. Secrets cracked like ice beneath thin shoes. and the Bogart house, with all its pride and dust and memory, was beginning to reveal the truth it had kept so long hidden. Chapter 7. A Whisper Between Sisters. It was nearing 10 o'clock when Poirot returned to the drawing-room. The lamps had been lowered, and the guests huddled in pairs or solitude, each consumed by their own thoughts. The air was thick with unspoken fear. Tea sat untouched. Conversation had died away. Even the fire seemed reluctant to crackle too loudly. Poirot took in the room, then gestured to Mr. Phipps, who waited silently in the doorway. "Would you be so kind, monsieur, as to ask Mrs. Grenville to join me in the conservatory?" The butler nodded once and disappeared. Poirot made his way to the conservatory, a long glass extension that faced the garden, now slick with rain and bathed in silver moonlight. He appreciated the space it allowed for quiet and, more importantly, for visibility. In such places, lies had fewer places to hide. Mrs. Ada Grenville arrived moments later, bundled in a knitted shawl, a tight smile drawn across her lips like an old scar. "You've been very methodical, Monsieur Poirot," she said, as she seated herself on a low bench near the potted orchids. Each of us summoned like schoolchildren awaiting a scolding. Poirot smiled warmly. "A scolding, madam?" "No. Only the hope that you might enlighten me." She shrugged. "I doubt I'll be of much use. I kept mostly to myself this weekend. I am not as entangled with the others as you may assume." "Ah, but that is precisely why I believe you will help me. You observe, perhaps, more than you speak." Her eyes, grey and restless, flicked toward the glass. "It's been a long time since anyone thought my quiet was useful." Poirot leaned slightly forward. "You have known Lady Estelle for many years?" "Since we were girls," she said, her voice softening. "We were raised in London together before the war. She was always proud even then. Her family had a name, mine did not, but we remained close until—" "Until?" "She married Lord Gerald, and I married Arthur Grenville, who promptly drank himself into disgrace and debt." Poirot nodded sympathetically. "And yet Lady Estelle invited you here?" "She always does, every spring, as if it rights some past imbalance. I suspect it's more pity than fondness." "Still," Poirot said, "you are here? You knew the staff?" Ada frowned. "Only in passing. The gardener was polite, Miss Lane unnerving." "In what way?" "She reminded me of the worst sort of schoolmistress. She had an eye that dissected you." "And you had no fondness for her?" Ada hesitated. "I found her theatrical. She tried to appear subservient, but relished her power. Estelle leaned on her far too much." Poirot steepled his fingers. "Did Miss Lane ever speak to you directly about the others?" "Not often, but once she mentioned Lucia." Poirot perked up. "What did she say?" "That the girl would bring ruin, that Estelle was a fool to consider revising the will. She said Lucia reminded her of someone. When I asked who, she just smiled and walked away." Poirot's brow furrowed. "You are not the first to report that. Curious, no?" "Perhaps Lucia has a resemblance," Ada said thoughtfully. "A family likeness from the past. Or perhaps Margot was merely being cryptic." Poirot watched her carefully. "Did she mention Colonel Frobisher?" A pause. Then, "Only that he'd taken to midnight strolls again. She said he was more dangerous now than when he held a rifle." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "Dangerous? That is not a casual word." "She was always dramatic," Ada said with a small laugh. "But no, I never saw him as such. Grumpy, yes. Dangerous? I doubt it." Poirot fell silent for a moment, then said gently, "And what of Chatterley?" Ada's demeanour shifted. "He's a solicitor. Greasy, polished, ambitious. He clings to this house like ivy to a crumbling wall. He knows his place is not secure unless he makes himself indispensable. Poirot tapped a finger to his lip. And to make oneself indispensable, one must sometimes remove obstacles. Ada looked away. If you're implying that Mr. Chatterley had something to do with Margot's death, I think you're underestimating the man. He's clever, but not bold. Poirot allowed a long pause to stretch between them. Madame, he said at last, one final question. Did you see Miss Lane at all the evening before her death? Ada's lips thinned. Briefly, we passed in the hallway. She was carrying a small locked box. I'd never seen it before. She clutched it like it was gold. Did you see where she went? To the east wing, Estelle's side. Poirot nodded slowly. And this locked box, did you ever see it again? No. Poirot rose, offering his hand to help her up. You have given me much to consider, Madame Granville. Perhaps more than you know? She gave a small nod and drifted out of the conservatory, her shawl trailing like shadow behind her. Poirot remained a moment longer, gazing out at the moonlit garden beyond the fogged glass. Somewhere in the silver dark of Bogart House, a locked box had vanished. A housekeeper had died, and among the voices of old friends and careful enemies, a single name, someone she reminded me of, echoed louder than ever. And Hercule Poirot, ever patient, ever precise, would find out who. Chapter 8. The Man with the Missing Past. The hallway outside the guest bedrooms was quiet as death. Poirot's polished shoes made no sound on the thick floral carpet as he moved with deliberate calm toward the final interview of the evening. A man who had been noticeably elusive since the events began. Mr. Elliot Pender. A late addition to the gathering, Pender was introduced simply as an acquaintance from Lady Estelle's philanthropic circle. But even before the crime, Poirot had noted a guarded nature in him, a man whose silences felt calculated, whose politeness was precise but distant. Poirot knocked twice on the door to the smallest guest room, and it opened swiftly, as though the occupant had been standing behind it. Elliot Pender was a slim man of perhaps 40, with pale hair, spectacles, and the kind of expression that made him appear simultaneously meek and unreadable. He wore a brown velvet smoking jacket and held a closed book in his hand. Monsieur Poirot, he said quietly, please come in. The room was modest, sparsely furnished, with an untouched tea tray on the writing desk. A single suitcase sat by the foot of the bed. The air was heavy with lavender, almost enough to mask the faint, unmistakable whiff of ink and pipe smoke. Poirot gestured to the book. You read to calm your mind, monsieur? Pender smiled faintly. To keep it occupied. Tonight offers little comfort. No, it does not. May I? He pointed toward a chair. Pender nodded. Poirot sat and folded his hands in his lap. You have kept rather to yourself since the incident? Pender shrugged lightly. I hardly knew Miss Lane. I thought it best not to intrude where grief is more genuine. An interesting way to phrase it, Poirot said softly. Tell me, monsieur, how long have you known Lady Estelle? Pender hesitated. 6 months. We met at a benefit concert for wounded soldiers. I serve on the board of a veterans' charity. She has a passion for supporting the arts. It was a natural connection. And yet, you were invited to a very private gathering. Pender's expression flickered. I suppose Lady Estelle found me agreeable company. Poirot tilted his head. You do not strike me as a man who relishes company. No, Pender agreed, but Lady Estelle and I shared certain conversations on solitude, on dignity, on things lost. Poirot narrowed his gaze. Things lost, like family? Pender met his eyes, and for a moment something unspoken hung in the air. Yes, he said finally. Like family. Poirot nodded slowly. "Forgive me, monsieur, but when you arrived the staff were unsure where to place you. Miss Lane was particularly bothered." Pender leaned forward. "May I speak plainly, Monsieur Poirot?" "But of course. I believe Miss Lane knew, or suspected, something about my past. Something I have spent many years keeping private. She watched me from the moment I stepped through the door." "And what is it you wish to keep private, monsieur?" Pender stood and crossed to the window, pulling the curtains slightly aside. "Before the war, I was known by another name. I was born Elliot Seddon. My father was disgraced in a financial scandal. A minor fraud, but enough to ruin the family. I left England, changed my name, and returned only recently. Lady Estelle never asked about it. Miss Lane, I suspect, found out." "Was she blackmailing you?" "I don't know," Pender said softly. "She hadn't approached me yet. But she left a note in my room this morning. I found it when I returned from the village." He handed Poirot a small, folded slip of paper. "Some debts aren't measured in money. I know who you are. Meet me in the Rose Corridor, tonight, after dinner." "She never came," Pender said. "Instead, she died." Poirot examined the note closely. Typed. Same machine, same smudged ink. The sender, undoubtedly Margot Lane. "And you did not go to the corridor?" "I did. At 9:30. It was empty. The windows were open. I waited 10 minutes. Then I returned here." Poirot regarded him in silence. "You said she hadn't blackmailed you yet. But you anticipated it?" Pender's voice lowered. "When someone like Margot Lane knows your past, they don't need to make demands to threaten you. The mere fact of knowledge is power." Poirot nodded gravely. "And fear is its own form of poison." He rose. "Merci, Monsieur Pendet. I shall keep your truth in confidence for now. But if Miss Lane was indeed planning to use your identity against you, then someone else may have known as well, someone who struck first." Pender said nothing, but the tightness in his shoulders gave his silence meaning. Poirot paused at the door. "One last thing. Did you recognize Lucia Vale when you arrived?" Pender blinked. "Lucia? Number should I have?" Poirot smiled thinly. "Perhaps not. But it is curious how often her name appears in conversation, like a melody we can't place, but feel we've heard before." Pender frowned, but Poirot offered no further comment. He closed the door gently behind him, leaving the man to his books and lavender perfume. Another secret exposed, another motive laid bare. And in the great hall below, the grandfather clock began its slow, mournful toll of the 11th hour. The game, Poirot thought, was no longer just about who killed Margot Lane. It was about what she knew that made her worth killing. Chapter 9. The echo beneath the stair, as the last toll of the grandfather clock faded into the long hush of midnight, Hercule Poirot made his way down the main staircase of Bogart House, his hand grazing the polished banister. The night had settled into a strange rhythm. Each revelation gave way to further doubt. Each alibi opened new doors rather than closing old ones. He reached the base of the stairs and turned, not toward the drawing-room or the firelit parlour where some of the guests still lingered, but toward the east wing hallway, a less travelled path that led to Lady Estelle's private study, and beyond it the once sealed family archive room. There was something haunting about the corridor. The faint scent of lavender from the housekeeper's soaps, the way the portraits hung a little too low, and the subtle creak of warped floorboards, like the house itself, remembered things no one wished to speak aloud. Poirot paused outside the study door, which was ajar. A narrow beam of lamplight cut through the gap. Inside he found Lucia Vale seated at Estelle's writing desk. She wore a robe of pale blue silk, slightly frayed at the cuffs. Her hair was loose over her shoulders, her posture oddly relaxed. "You do not sleep, mademoiselle?" Poirot asked gently. Lucia didn't startle. She merely glanced up at him. "I find sleep avoids places like this, or perhaps people like me." "Is that guilt speaking?" he asked, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. "Or memory," she murmured. "They're often the same thing." Poirot sat across from her. The desk between them was cluttered. Letters, a fountain pen, an open ledger. The top drawer had been left ajar. "Did Lady Estelle permit you to review her papers?" Poirot asked. "She did not forbid it," Lucia said evenly. "That's enough sometimes. And what were you looking for?" Lucia hesitated, then sighed. "Something Margot said to me, weeks ago. We were alone, passing on the back stairwell. She stopped me and said, 'You're not the first girl to think she could change her story in this house.'" Poirot's brow lifted slightly. "What do you believe she meant?" Lucia gave a half smile. "I thought she was being cruel, but now I think she knew something about me I didn't know myself." Poirot leaned forward slightly. "Mademoiselle Vale, your file, what little I have reviewed, suggests your parentage was never fully documented. You were adopted, yes?" "Yes, by my aunt and uncle in Devon. My mother, my birth mother, died before I was old enough to remember. I know only that she worked in service once, somewhere in the south." "And your father?" Lucia shook her head. "No record, just a blank space." Poirot tapped a finger against his chin. "Miss Lane was known for her record-keeping and for knowing the shadows of others. Perhaps she discovered the truth about your origins?" Lucia's eyes darkened. "Are you suggesting I killed her to silence that truth?" "I suggest nothing," Poirot said softly. "But I do believe that she had come across something perhaps in the archive room. A letter, a certificate, something that changed how she viewed you." Lucia looked down at her hands. "She started treating me differently last month. At first, it was cold, then almost kind. She brought me my mother's locket, said she'd found it among the estate's stored things. But when I asked how she knew it was mine, she only smiled." Poirot's eyes sharpened. "You have this locket?" Lucia reached beneath her robe and pulled it out, a delicate oval of rose gold etched with ivy leaves. Poirot leaned in to examine it. On the back was a barely legible inscription, to E, always from GB. His eyes narrowed. "E?" he asked. Lucia nodded. "My mother's name was Eleanor, I think." "And GB," Poirot whispered. "Gerald Bogart." Lucia looked up, confused. "You think—" Poirot sat back, exhaling slowly. "I think Miss Lane was protecting a secret larger than herself. A child, a legacy, something the family buried." Lucia's voice was small now. "You believe I'm his daughter?" "I believe someone in this house does," Poirot said quietly. "And if that is true, mademoiselle, your presence threatens not just reputations but inheritance, and perhaps even liberty." She trembled slightly, clasping the locket in both hands. "Why wouldn't Lady Estelle tell me?" "Perhaps she doesn't know," Poirot said. "Or perhaps she feared what the truth would mean, for you, for her, for the estate." Lucia looked toward the fireplace, as though trying to see her own reflection in the embers. Poirot stood. "Mademoiselle, I ask you to speak of this to no one, not yet. The time will come." She nodded, her voice barely audible. "You believe me?" "I believe in facts," Poirot said gently. "And the facts, mademoiselle, are speaking louder by the hour." As he left the study, Poirot paused once in the hallway, his hand brushing against the stair rail. And there, from the shadows beneath the stairs, came a soft creak. He turned, but saw no one, only silence, and somewhere, someone holding their breath in the dark. Chapter 10. The Box That Should Not Be. The hour had passed into the deeper folds of night when Poirot, ever meticulous, returned to the ground floor and asked Mr. Phipps for one final favour. "If you would be so kind, monsieur," he said gently to the butler, "I should like to inspect Miss Lane's room." Phipps, clearly uncomfortable, nodded with the barest movement of his head. "Of course, sir, it hasn't been touched. Lady Estelle ordered it left as it was." "Très bien." They ascended the narrow staircase that led to the servants' quarters. The corridor here was plain and dimly lit, the air close, the floorboards worn. Miss Lane's room was the first on the right, an austere little chamber, functional rather than inviting. A small bed, a mirrored dressing table, and a wardrobe made up the furnishings. The only touch of vanity was a lace cloth over the side table, on which sat a small bottle of lavender water and a frayed paperback novel. Poirot stood still in the doorway for a moment before stepping inside. "She lived simply," he observed. "Very simply," said Phipps. "Margot was a woman of order, never waste time on fripperies." Poirot's eyes swept the space, his attention drawn to the writing desk tucked into the corner. Unlike the dressing table, it was meticulously organized, ink bottle precisely placed, blotting paper folded neatly, several envelopes stacked on the corner, all blank. Poirot moved to the wardrobe and opened it. Inside hung 3 uniforms, identical black dresses with white collars. The shoes beneath them were polished, aligned toe to heel. Nothing out of place, nothing, except for the strong box on the top shelf. It was modest in size, steel-bound, with a clasp that required a key. Poirot gestured to it. "Monsieur Phipps, do you know if Miss Lane kept the key on her person?" Phipps hesitated. "Possibly. She wore a chain around her neck, tucked into her dress. I assumed it was a cross." Poirot nodded. "We shall see." He reached into his coat and withdrew a small velvet pouch containing several fine tools. With surgical delicacy, he worked the clasp open, pausing only when he heard the faintest click. Inside, nestled between letters and folded documents, lay a collection of items that sent a ripple through Poirot's controlled expression. The topmost item was the missing photograph of Lady Estelle's late husband, Lord Gerald, young, handsome, and unmistakably holding a baby. The photograph was creased, the back marked only with the number 1903. Poirot set it aside and picked up a small envelope marked "Private for Estelle only." He did not open it. Instead, he examined the folded sheet beneath it. It was a birth certificate. He read it slowly, carefully, lips barely moving. Name, Lucia Eleanor Vale. Date of birth, 14th October, 1903. Mother, Eleanor Vale. Father, Gerald W. Bogart. Poirot stared at the paper in silence. The truth, long buried, had been here all along. Miss Lane had known, had kept it hidden. But had she planned to reveal it or use it as leverage? Beneath the certificate was another letter, typed, unsigned. "You have delayed this long enough. If you don't act, I will. The girl's presence threatens everything you've built. Choose now, or I will make the choice for you." The paper was similar to the others. Thick stock, smudged ink. But the tone, sharp, commanding, was different from the blackmail notes. This was not extortion. It was a warning, a deadline. "Monsieur?" Phipps spoke softly behind him. "Shall I summon Lady Estelle?" "Non," Poirot replied, folding the documents and returning them carefully to the box. "Not yet." He closed the strong box and tucked it under his arm. "Have the guests retired?" he asked. "Most, yes. Only Colonel Frobisher is still in the billiard room." "Bon, let him stay. The game is nearly over." As they descended the servants' staircase again, Poirot's mind worked in perfect silence. The pieces were aligning. A secret daughter, a hidden inheritance, a set of typed notes from multiple sources, a murder executed with precision, planned but not panicked. Someone had killed Margot Lane not in rage but in calculation. Someone who feared the truth more than guilt. As they passed through the hallway, Poirot paused near the base of the stairs, the same place he had heard the creak earlier. And there, now visible in the faint light from the hall sconce, was a footprint, just one, smudged in dust, slight, narrow, and elegant, a woman's. Poirot stared at it for several seconds, then looked upward toward the shadows under the landing. Someone had been there, listening to his conversation with Lucia. Someone who now knew that the truth was no longer buried. And if Poirot's instincts were right, they would strike again before dawn. Chapter 11. The Poison in the Portrait. The storm had finally died. Rain had turned to mist, and the grounds of Bogart House were now bathed in a spectral quiet, the garden lamps casting long shadows across damp hedges and rain-speckled stone paths. Inside, however, the tension only deepened, thickening like smoke around each corner Poirot passed. It was well past midnight when he returned to the drawing-room. Only Colonel Frobisher remained awake, seated in the high-backed chair near the fireplace, puffing furiously on a cigar. The fire had dwindled to embers. His coat was off, sleeves rolled to the elbow, the man as restless as a lion pacing in a shrinking cage. He eyed Poirot with suspicion. "Still prowling?" he asked. Poirot sat opposite him. "The night does not quiet the questions, mon colonel. It only makes them clearer." Frobisher grunted. "You've got your answers yet?" "I have. Many pieces. And now, perhaps, the corner that frames the picture." He leaned forward. "Tell me, Colonel, do you remember the portrait of Lady Estelle's husband in the drawing-room?" Frobisher raised an eyebrow. "The Admiral?" "Of course. Every room in this place has a reminder of that man." Poirot nodded. "Oui? But the portrait I refer to is the one hanging in the upstairs corridor, the smaller one, the one few guests notice." Frobisher frowned. "A copy, isn't it? Estelle had that painted after his death." "Precisely," said Poirot. "But there is a curious detail, one I noticed tonight as I passed by. In that portrait, Lord Gerald wears a pin on his lapel, a naval brooch. Yet in the official portraits, downstairs and in newspaper records, he never wore such an ornament." The Colonel tilted his head. "What of it?" Poirot's eyes glinted. "In the attic I found a similar brooch, hidden inside the strong-box belonging to Margot Lane. With it was a birth certificate for Lucia Vale. Father, Gerald Bogart." Frobisher's cigar paused mid-air. "You're saying Lucia is the Admiral's daughter?" "I am saying Margot believed she was, and she had proof. She also had letters, warnings, from someone afraid of what would happen should that truth emerge." Frobisher sat very still. "And who do you suspect wrote those letters?" Poirot smiled faintly. "There is the question. But first, do you recall what you said to me earlier, that Miss Lane had grown too bold, that she was watching everyone, she accused you of hiding something in the West Wing?" "She was always sniffing about," Frobisher muttered, "but I kept nothing in the West Wing." "You said she was carrying a locked box 2 nights ago, that she was tearing up papers outside Estelle's study, that she knew too much." "She knew too much," the Colonel echoed reluctantly. Poirot leaned forward. "Then let us suppose she intended to reveal the truth about Lucia's parentage. Suppose she planned to hand it all to Lady Estelle, or worse, to Lucia herself. That would endanger the estates, future the revised will, Estelle's grasp on her legacy. Frobisher gave him a long look. You think Estelle killed her? I think Lady Estelle has long clung to pride, to order, to control. She depended on Margot to manage her world, but if that same woman turned, threatened everything she'd built— The Colonel said nothing. Poirot rose and crossed to the decanter at the sideboard. He poured himself a finger of sherry and continued softly. There is something else. The poison. Frobisher looked up sharply. It was not in the tea leaves, Poirot said, nor in the water. It was in the mug. The blue-rimmed one, Miss Lane's favourite, the one she always used. Ivy said she prepared the tea herself. Frobisher said she did, but someone had already coated the inside of the mug with a thin extract, plant-based, bitter, slow-acting, most likely added earlier that day, knowing Margot's habits. It would have required access to the servants' kitchen, knowledge of her routines, and a calm, methodical hand. Frobisher's voice dropped. You think it was someone who knew the staff, someone who wouldn't raise alarm in the kitchen? Poirot gave a slight nod. I spoke with Chatterley, with Ada, with Pender. All of them had secrets to hide, but none of them possessed the intimacy with Miss Lane's habits that would allow such precise timing. But there is one who did. He turned slowly. The person Margot served, the woman she protected, the one she may have betrayed. The fire cracked behind them, and then from the hallway came a soft cough. Both men turned as Lady Estelle Bogart appeared in the doorway, draped in a dark shawl, her face unreadable. "You've been busy, Monsieur Poirot," she said, voice trembling ever so slightly. Poirot set down his glass. "Oui, madame, and I believe you have been too." Lady Estelle did not flinch. She stepped into the room and closed the door behind her with deliberate grace. "Then perhaps," she said, "you should finish what you've begun, before someone else does it for you." Poirot inclined his head. "Indeed, madame, it is time." And he knew that with dawn approaching, the hour of revelation would soon be upon them all. Chapter 12. A tonic for silence. The morning light had yet to break when Poirot gathered his thoughts in solitude at the edge of the long corridor that separated the drawing-room from Lady Estelle's private quarters. The conversation with Colonel Frobisher had sharpened the shape of the truth. But it was Lady Estelle's sudden appearance, measured, theatrical, calculated, that revealed the depths yet untouched. She had not come to confess. She had come to watch. Poirot waited 10 minutes before requesting a word with Mr. Chatterley, who emerged from the dining-room bleary-eyed, his waistcoat half-buttoned, and his hand shaking slightly from too little sleep, and perhaps too many lies. "May we speak in private, monsieur?" Poirot asked politely. Chatterley blinked. "Must we?" Poirot smiled gently. "I am afraid it is no longer a matter of choice." They walked together to the breakfast-room, now empty and still faintly shadowed by the memory of death. The rug where Margot Lane had fallen had been discreetly removed, leaving the floorboards bare and scuffed. Poirot motioned for Chatterley to sit. He did not. "You've spoken to Estelle," the solicitor said softly. "I have. And I believe she is holding on to something far heavier than grief." Chatterley's face twitched, but he said nothing. Poirot leaned forward slightly. "You told me earlier you had no personal quarrel with Miss Lane, but you omitted something important, the documents she kept, the locked box." "I didn't know it existed," Chatterley said carefully. "You didn't possess the key, but you knew she had files, correspondence, records, things she kept out of sight." Chatterley sighed, defeated. "I suspected, yes. Margot was meticulous. She had her own order, one that didn't answer to me. Poirot studied him for a moment. And you feared that what she found might alter the future of the estate, specifically Lucia's position. Chatterley's eyes flicked upward. You think she's Gerald Bogart's child? Poirot said nothing. Chatterley laughed bitterly. It would explain a great deal. He stepped away from the table, running a hand through his thinning hair. Estelle came to me last winter. She was ill, though she would never admit it to anyone but me. There were days she couldn't hold a pen, let alone sign a document. She asked me to prepare a new will, one that included Lucia as a beneficiary, not sole heir, but prominent. Poirot's brows lifted. And Margot Lane objected? She didn't say so openly, but she began to change, hovering, asking questions, disappearing into the archive room at night. She told me once, in confidence, that certain truths were best kept buried. Poirot stood and walked slowly toward the sideboard, his voice low and precise. And so, monsieur, we come to the bottle. Chatterley turned sharply. What bottle? The tonic, the one prepared for Lady Estelle each evening. Ivy told me Miss Lane handled the preparation, but not the serving. There was a beat of silence. Do you know what was in that tonic? Poirot asked. Chatterley's voice came out dry. I assumed it was harmless. A sedative. Poirot turned to face him. Harmless, yes, but in the right quantity, mixed with the wrong element, it becomes bitter, metallic, nearly indistinguishable in herbal tea. Chatterley's face paled. You think? I think someone used what was meant to numb the mind to end it entirely. Chatterley stepped back, visibly rattled. You believe I killed her? I believe you knew what was possible, and you did not stop it. Perhaps you thought she was bluffing, that her knowledge would never come to light. Or perhaps someone else decided for you. Poirot stepped closer, voice calm. Where were you between 8:15 and 8:30 last night? I told you, fetching water. Poirot gave a small shake of his head. You were standing near the pantry, monsieur. I found ink on the floor. You had your gloves in your pocket. A draft letter, perhaps. Something you wanted to destroy. Or something Miss Lane had just handed back to you. Chatterley didn't respond. You knew she was planning to confront Estelle, or Lucia. You followed her to the pantry. She made tea. She left her mug on the counter. And in the moments she turned away, someone, perhaps not you, slipped the tincture into it. Chatterley's voice was hoarse. It wasn't me, I swear to you. Poirot studied him for a long moment, then said softly, You may be right. Chatterley's head lifted. Poirot gave a small, polite nod. But if you are lying, the truth will still find you. He turned and exited the room, leaving Chatterley in silence, his hands shaking more violently now. Poirot moved once more through the east wing, retracing his steps, revisiting every space where shadow had fallen thickest. The study, the stairwell, the servants' passage. Each corner had its tale, and none of them were finished. At last he paused outside the door to Lady Estelle's bedchamber. He knocked once. A quiet voice answered from within. Come. Poirot opened the door. Inside, Lady Estelle sat at her vanity, the locket in her hand. She did not look up. I suppose you've come to ask, she said. Poirot stepped into the room. No, madam, he said gently. I've come to tell you it is nearly morning, and by then I must gather everyone, because the truth, madame, the truth no longer waits. Chapter 13. The Letter That Changed Everything. Lady Estelle Bogart sat perfectly still, her thin fingers clasped around the delicate locket as if it were the only thing keeping her rooted to the earth. Her vanity table, was as meticulously arranged as her life had once been: silver brushes, ivory-handled pens, a bottle of rosewater. But beneath the powder and polish there was something crumbling. Poirot saw it clearly now. She met his gaze in the mirror. "So," she said softly, "you found it?" "I did, madame," Poirot replied. "The birth certificate, the letters, the photograph, even the brooch your late husband wore only in private." Estelle's voice was hollow. "She kept them all. I should have destroyed them long ago." "But you didn't," Poirot said gently, "because some part of you knew they mattered, that the girl mattered." Estelle looked down at the locket, her voice trembling. "She is his child. I knew it the moment I saw her eyes. Gerald tried to keep it from me, but I am not a fool. When Eleanor Vale left the estate, she was with child. Margot was the only one who helped her. She knew everything." "And she kept it from you all these years?" "She promised me she would never tell," Estelle whispered. "But something changed this year. Lucia arrived and Margot grew conflicted. Perhaps she wanted to see her reunited with her history. Perhaps she thought I owed the truth to her. Or perhaps—" She paused, voice tightening. "She wanted power." "Power she could only hold," Poirot said softly. "If she threatened to reveal what you had tried so hard to bury." Estelle's hand tightened on the locket. "I loved Gerald, even when he betrayed me. Even when he died and left me with his silence. But the scandal, the inheritance, it would have ruined everything. Bogart House, my name, Lucia's place in the world. You don't understand, Monsieur Poirot. The truth may be sacred to you, but to women like me, it is often a weapon." "I do understand, madame," Poirot said, "but murder is not a shield. It is a fracture from which nothing heals." She didn't respond. Poirot took a step closer, lowering his voice. "Did you kill her?" "No," Estelle said at once. "But I was tempted. I admit it." "Then who did?" Estelle was silent for a long time. Finally, she rose from the chair and moved to a cabinet by the window. She unlocked it with a key from around her neck and removed a small envelope, yellowed with age. Her hands trembled as she handed it to Poirot. "This arrived the day before Margot died. It was not addressed to me, but to her. It had been misdelivered." Poirot unfolded the envelope. Inside was a typed note, short and cold. "The girl must leave." "If you don't act, I will. You've had your chance." "The decision has been made." There was no signature, no return address, but the ink, the spacing, it matched the others. Poirot's brows furrowed. "This was not written by you." "No," Estelle said, "and I don't believe it was Chatterley either. He lacks the nerve, and Frobisher, for all his bark, is too direct." She turned away from him, looking out into the pale blue light of the coming morning. "There's only one person in this house who has reason to feel both loyalty and fear, who had access to the kitchen, the pantry, the tea, who moved between the staff and the family without suspicion, and who loved me more than she feared me." Poirot stood very still. "Phipps," he said quietly. Lady Estelle nodded once, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. "He served my husband for 30 years. He watched this house fall apart. He watched me struggle to keep it intact. And when Margot threatened to dismantle it all, he acted. Not out of hate, out of devotion." Poirot's voice was gentle. "Did he tell you?" "Number. But I saw the change in him after Margot's death. He avoids my eyes now. And I found a bottle of valerian tincture hidden in the scullery, just strong enough to kill if given in the wrong dose. Phipps would have known that. He mixed my tonic every night when Margot was indisposed." Poirot exhaled slowly. "And yet you said nothing?" Estelle looked at him. "Would you have, after everything I've done to protect this house, to protect her?" Poirot's expression remained unreadable. "I will speak with him," he said at last. "But the law, madame, it is not mine to bend. There must be justice." Estelle's voice was quiet. "Then let it come gently. Not for me. For him." Poirot bowed once and turned to leave, but as he reached the threshold, she called out, "Do you believe in mercy, Monsieur Poirot?" He paused, hand on the doorknob. "I believe," he said, "that the truth and mercy must walk side by side, but they do not always arrive together." And with that, he stepped into the hall, where the house, at last, was waking. Chapter 14. The Butler's Silence. The scent of old books and beeswax still hung faintly in the corridor as Poirot descended to the ground floor once more. It was just past 6. Dawn had broken, casting pale light through the tall windows of Bogart House, revealing dust motes in the air and long shadows beneath the polished stair rails. Poirot did not hesitate. He made his way directly to the butler's pantry. Phipps was already there, predictably. Dressed in crisp black despite the hour, he was aligning the morning service tray with practiced precision. But as Poirot entered, he froze with one hand resting on a silver sugar bowl. "Ah," Poirot said gently, "you are most efficient, Monsieur Phipps, even in the aftermath of murder." Phipps's face betrayed no emotion. "The household must still function, monsieur. Guests expect civility regardless of tragedy." Poirot stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "And yet, you are not quite yourself this morning. You did not join the others. You avoided Lady Estelle." Phipps resumed polishing a teacup. "It is not my place to intrude." "No," Poirot said, "but it was your place to serve. You brewed the tonics. You handled the pantry. You were the one person Margot Lane never suspected, because you had always been there, beneath notice." The teacup clinked softly against the counter. Phipps did not look up. "I did not want it to come to this," he said quietly. Poirot waited, silent. "She was going to destroy her," Phipps continued. "Lady Estelle had held this house together for decades, and Margot, she had all the pieces. She knew about Lucia, about Gerald. She said she would speak to the girl directly." "And you were afraid," Poirot said. Phipps nodded. "I saw what it would do, the scandal, the inheritance. Estelle's heart could not have borne it. So yes, I added a few drops to her mug, not to kill, only to slow her, to delay her until I could speak with Lady Estelle. But something changed. The dose was too strong, or perhaps her heart—" He stopped, jaw tightening. Poirot stepped forward. "You knew the risks.
You knew what valerian mixed with her tonic could do." Phipps set the teacup down and faced him fully now. "I did, and I would do it again." A silence stretched between them, broken only by the soft ticking of the wall clock. Poirot's voice was measured. "Justice, Monsieur Phipps, is not vengeance, nor is it devotion. It is truth, spoken in full. You must come with me now. The authorities will arrive soon." Phipps straightened his coat, composed and dignified even in confession. "I will go," he said quietly. "But please, monsieur, do not let her name be dragged through the mud." Poirot nodded once. "That I promise." As he escorted the butler down the corridor, the house remained still, watching, listening, remembering. The truth had come at last, but not without a price. Chapter 15. The Final Gathering. The sun had risen fully by the time Poirot entered the grand salon, its tall windows flooded with a grey, forgiving light. The storm had passed. Birds chirped faintly from the hedges outside, as though oblivious to the unravelling of secrets within the house's walls. At Poirot's request, all the remaining guests had assembled. They came in slowly, faces drawn, eyes hollow,
from a sleepless night. Lady Estelle, composed as ever, sat in her usual seat near the fireplace. Colonel Frobisher remained standing, arms folded tightly, his expression carved in granite. Chatterley sat by the window, fingers twitching. Lucia Vale, pale and alert, perched on the edge of a settee, her locket tucked beneath her collar. Even Elliot Pende arrived, hat in hand, uncertain but present. Poirot stood in the centre of the room like a conductor poised before an orchestra. He waited until the room had stilled. Then he spoke. "Mesdames et messieurs, I thank you for your patience. We have all been unsettled by the tragic death of Miss Margot Lane. But I believe now we can lay her soul and her secrets to rest." No one interrupted. Poirot clasped his hands behind his back. This was not a crime of passion. It was not done in haste. It was planned, calculated, and it began not yesterday, but decades ago, when a young servant named Eleanor Vale gave birth to a daughter on this very estate. Lucia's head snapped up, her breath catching. She was dismissed quietly, without scandal, aided only by one person, Margot Lane, who remained loyal not only to Lady Estelle, but to the truth she helped conceal. That child was Lucia. Gasps rose from the guests, but Poirot raised a hand for silence. Miss Lane kept records, letters, a photograph, even a birth certificate, all of which I found in a locked box in her quarters. She had the proof, and she intended, finally, to reveal it. He turned toward Lady Estelle. "But the truth, madame, is rarely easy. You feared what it would do, not only to your name, but to Lucia's future. And so did another." Poirot's gaze swept the room. Miss Lane brewed her own tea that night, but the cup she used, her usual chipped mug, had already been prepared. A small dose of valerian, laced with a toxic extract, was left inside, enough to kill. The person who did this had access to the kitchen, the pantry, and the servants' quarters. Someone invisible to us all. He let the words settle. "It was your butler, Mr. Phipps." A murmur broke through the silence. Estelle's hands trembled slightly, but she did not speak. "He confessed to me this morning. He believed he was protecting Lady Estelle, that by stopping Margot he was preserving the house, the legacy. But even acts of loyalty, when they end in death, must face justice." Poirot took a step back, his tone softening. Margot Lane was not a kind woman, but she was a guardian of memory. And memory, mes amis, has a way of returning when we least expect it. He turned, at last, to Lucia. "You, mademoiselle, were at the centre of a truth others feared. But it is not a truth to be ashamed of. You are not a scandal. You are the daughter of this house, whether written in wills or not." Lucia, tears shining in her eyes, whispered, "And what now?" Poirot gave a small, solemn smile. "Now we mourn, we reflect, and then we begin again." Outside, the morning light crept across the floor like a benediction. Inside, the silence of revelation was at last complete. Chapter 16. A house set in order. The guests began to disperse in slow, uncertain steps. The room, once heavy with suspicion, was now filled with a more subtle weight, grief. But it was not only for the woman who had died, it was grief for illusions lost, for reputations quietly shattered, for truths long buried that could no longer be ignored. Poirot remained where he stood, watching them. Lady Estelle was the last to rise. Her composure remained outwardly intact, but Poirot saw the tremble in her gloved hand as she reached for her cane. She paused beside Lucia, resting a frail hand on the young woman's shoulder. "I did not know how to tell you," she said softly. "I feared it would change everything." Lucia looked up at her, eyes still rimmed with disbelief. But there was something else now, not anger, not resentment, understanding. "It changes nothing," she replied. "Or perhaps it changes everything, but I'm still me." Estelle gave a small, sad smile. "You are your mother's daughter." Poirot said nothing, merely watching the moment unfold like a portrait catching its final brushstroke. Then he turned, retreating once more into the hall, where the servants had begun to re-emerge, their presence tentative, the weight of the household slowly shifting back into routine. At the front door, Chief Inspector Havering had arrived, his constables in tow. Poirot met him on the steps. "You'll find the confession in my study," Poirot said. "The butler is waiting. He is calm. You will not need force." Havering glanced at him. "Clean work, Poirot." "Non, monsieur, it is never—"
"Clean. Only necessary." Havering nodded and went inside. Poirot remained outside for a moment, his eyes on the garden path where wet leaves glistened under the early sun. The storm had washed everything, but left behind a strange clarity, like water over glass. Lucia joined him quietly. She stood beside him, uncertain at first. "Will I inherit?" she asked. Poirot turned to her. "Legally, that depends on what Estelle places in her new will, but morally, emotionally, I believe she has already made that decision." Lucia looked down. "Margot died for this?" "Yes," Poirot said gently. "But perhaps she believed it was worth it. She didn't tell me, not directly." "Sometimes," Poirot said. "Those who love you most do not tell you who you are. They leave you to discover it yourself." Lucia nodded, wiping her eyes. "And what happens to all the rest? Chatterley, Frobisher, Ada?" "They returned to their lives, changed perhaps, but not condemned. Each played a part, but only one acted with fatal intent." She was silent for a long moment. "And you, Monsieur Poirot, what do you do now?" He smiled faintly. "I take the next train to London. There is always another mystery, mademoiselle. But this house, this one, is now at peace." She looked up at him, and her voice dropped. "Thank you." Poirot bowed slightly, then turned toward the gravel path where his bag had already been brought down. As he stepped into the morning light, the house behind him no longer loomed. It stood instead in stillness, weathered, watched, and finally understood. And Bogart House, once silenced by secrets, could now begin to speak again. Chapter 17. The Quiet Departure. The train to London departed at 9:30, a modest, whistling engine that wound its way along the coast with the dignity of an old friend. Hercule Poirot, seated alone in the first-class compartment, gazed out the window, watching the mist roll across the fields like a memory too stubborn to lift. His valise sat beside him, the birth certificate tucked safely within. Not as evidence, it would never be needed in court now, but as a reminder of what had been hidden, of what had been revealed. The countryside blurred past, and still Poirot's mind worked. He had seen such endings before. The truth exposed, the guilty taken, the wounded left to rebuild. Yet something in Bogart House lingered with him. Not the intricacies of the case, though they were delicate. Not even the human drama, though it had been rich with betrayal and longing. No, it was the silence that followed the solution. There had been no victory, no applause. Only the strange hush of understanding. The kind that settled over a family when its myths had been dismantled but not destroyed. They would move on, Lady Estelle, carrying the weight of her past with more dignity than before. Lucia discovering herself not as a claimant to wealth, but as the rightful heir to truth. Even Chatterley.
And Frobisher, who would whisper the story in quiet tones at London clubs, would not forget what had passed. Poirot tapped a gloved finger on the window glass. Phipps's face came to mind, stoic to the end, loyal to a fault. His crime had not been born of hatred nor greed, but of misplaced love. That, in some ways, made it more tragic. He had tried to preserve order, and in doing so had unravelled the very thing he sought to protect. Poirot sighed. "Murder," he murmured, "is never merely an act. It is a culmination." A knock at the door broke his thoughts. The train attendant, a young man in a neatly pressed uniform, stood with a tray. "Coffee, monsieur?" "Merci," Poirot replied with a polite smile, accepting the cup. He took it gently, savouring the warmth. "Where are you headed?" the young man asked, with idle curiosity. Poirot tilted his head. "London, for now. But I imagine my journey does not end there." The attendant grinned. "Not with your reputation, monsieur. People say you solve crimes no one else dares to understand." Poirot's smile faded into something gentler. "No, mon ami, I listen, that is all." He raised the coffee to his lips as the train curved through a grove of bare trees, their limbs stark against the pale sky. Somewhere behind him a house stood still and quiet, its halls no longer echoing with suspicion. And ahead, more voices waited, more puzzles whispered through corridors and carriages. Poirot would find them in time. For now he sat with his thoughts and the faint scent of lavender, and the memory of a house where silence had once ruled, but no longer. Chapter 18. The Reflection in the Mirror. 2 days later, nestled in the calm of his London flat, Hercule Poirot sat in his high-backed chair before the hearth. Outside, the rain tapped politely against the window-pane, far gentler than the storm that had raged over Bogart House. The case was concluded, the official report filed, the constables thanked. But, as was his custom, Poirot reviewed each detail once more, not for necessity, but for completeness. He turned in his chair and retrieved a small, black-bound notebook from the side table. Inside, every clue was noted with his fastidious handwriting. A final summation awaited. He began with a single line. The motive was not hatred, it was fear wrapped in devotion. Margot Lane, for all her severity, had been the last keeper of a dangerous truth, that Lucia Vale, the seemingly minor guest in a spring gathering, was in fact the illegitimate daughter of Lord Gerald Bogart. A secret bound in paper, sealed by loyalty, and locked away in a steel box. Margot had guarded it for years, but with Lucia grown, with Estelle's health faltering, she had chosen to act. Whether out of justice or personal reckoning, Poirot could not say with certainty, but others had sensed it. Lady Estelle, proud and frightened, had hoped the truth would die with the past. Elliot Pender had feared exposure. Chatterley, the ever-loyal solicitor, had known revealing Lucia's bloodline would reorder everything, inheritance, property, legacy. And yet it was Phipps, quiet, invisible Phipps, who took action. He had slipped the tincture into Margot's mug, not intending death, he claimed, only delay. But intent mattered little when the result was irreversible. A loyal act born from fear had tipped into crime. Poirot closed the notebook slowly. Justice had been served. The butler would stand trial, though Poirot's testimony would paint him not as a monster, but as a man worn thin by duty and love. Estelle, in turn, had rewritten her will, this time without secrets. Lucia had accepted nothing immediately, save the chance to remain. A daughter of the house, at last recognized, yet burdened with history's weight. He rose from his chair and approached the mirror above the fireplace. It was oval, with a gilded edge, slightly foxed with age. Poirot adjusted his moustache with care, then stared into his own eyes, not with vanity, but with inquiry. Was it a victory? He had solved the puzzle. The facts fit together like a fine watch. But as always, behind the crime lay human sorrow, fear, silence, love, all tangled into a single desperate moment that could not be undone. No, it was not a victory, it was understanding. He turned as a soft knock came at the door. It was his valet George, carrying the morning paper. Poirot accepted it with a nod. The headline was modest: "Tragedy at Bogart House. Butler charged in housekeeper's death." Poirot folded it neatly without reading further. "There are no heroes in this one, George," he murmured. "Only the truth. And sometimes that is enough." George gave a slight, professional bow and withdrew. Poirot walked to the window, watching the clouds roll gently across the sky. London continued below him, unaware of the secrets solved in distant Cornwall. He smiled faintly. Perhaps it was time for a small holiday. But even as he thought it, he knew. Soon another case would come, another whisper in the night, another secret too heavy for silence to carry. And Hercule Poirot, orderly, observant, unyielding, would be ready, as always.